So Happy New Year from quite a stormy UK to the rest of the UK, to Dubai and Malaysia. And I'm going to talk today about learning beyond the machine. I think it's an importantly hype-corrected new year. According to the MIT Technology Review, 2025 was the year of the great hype correction. So 2026, we're going to be happy, we're going to be hype corrected. Maybe 2026 then will be the year more of cope. I do think if we're looking back at the last year, as we should, moving into the new, some of these hype corrections have been really quite extraordinary. So people for whom AI was going to be the great sunlit future of education within months or years are saying, well, of course, it was never going to be magical. It's not going to fix things that were broken. It's going to amplify the broken things. And it's not immediately going to replace expertise. And of course, I welcome these hype corrections, but also can't help remembering that exactly the opposite was being said not very long ago by some of the same people. I want to start on the next slide with a study that came out fairly recently called Women Worry, Men Adopt. It's a study about the gender differences and other differences in adoption of AI. Well, I'm going to look at that briefly and think about what it is that women might worry about. Then I'm going to think about what this move from hype to cope might mean in terms of the things that we really care about, which of course are student learning and student progression, student graduate employment, where students might be going, how we're preparing them for that. I have to tell you, if you're looking for a really cheery, happy, upbeat, leaping into spring kind of message, you could go for a cup of tea now and come back in about 20 minutes, because we're going to be going downhill for a little bit. And then we're going to be going back up again, because we're going to be talking about how we can recover some agency for teaching through various methods and also through particularly the conversations that we have. So let's look at that study, Women Worry, Men Adopt. It was a very well-meaning study which was trying to understand the conundrum about why the differences between men and women in terms of AI adoption, generative AI adoption, are really as big as they are. And they're quite astonishing. They can be as much as 22% in some of these studies. And of course, the solution that these authors came up with is for women to worry less so that our adoption can catch up and be equalized. But maybe there's something that some of these women who have been exited and sidelined from the AI industry worry about that might be part of our AI curriculum in a broader sense. So some of the things that women particularly worry about, and I'm not going to gender this, I'm going to welcome men and people of all genders to worry about some of these things. Women worry about mainly environmental, social and ethical impacts. And as the study says, this heightened sensitivity to those impacts is not actually misplaced. So we're not worrying about something that isn't for real. We're worrying about things that might actually be, in some cases, reasons to slow, to be discerning, to be selective, to be thoughtful about the adoption of AI. Of course, I'm being ironic. I don't think these worries should be or are limited to women. But I think this gendered framing is really interesting, because there is a long history in the AI industry of very experienced, highly paid and expert AI engineers who begin to worry about some of these issues being sidelined and exited from the industry. So let's hear what some of those women worry about. So Kate Crawford has wrote a wonderful book about AI in which she suggests that really AI shouldn't be framed in terms of the specific models and interfaces and services that the industry is trying to sell to us, but really all the way through the AI stack, from the minerals in the ground, through the servers that are hosting the data architectures, to the services we see and the interfaces we use, and to the discourse we have about AI. And she asks, who do these systems all the way through the stack serve? What are the political economies of their construction and distribution? And what might the wider planetary consequences be? Some of us worry about the fact that a very small number of companies have been able to use this narrative to accrue more and more of those resources, more capital, more land, more energy, water, and data. In fact, unless you go back really to the early days of European colonialism, it's hard to think there's been such a concentration of capital, energy, expertise, data in such a small number of hands. Some of us worry about that. Some of us worry about the exploitation of data workers, and of course the exploitation of original creatives whose materials have been captured and reused by these architectures, and that is ongoing. That wasn't just something that was one and done. Timnit Gebru is one of the voices from AI, from inside AI, who's drawn attention to the issue of exploitation. We worry about the planet. We worry about the training costs in terms of energy, compute, electricity, carbon that it costs to train some of these models, which has been rising. And we worry about the overall cost in terms of the build out of data centers, their water use, their electricity grab, and the fact that some of these build outs have actually been politically very contentious and have been resisted. What else do people worry about who maybe are not adopting AI at the speed that some other people are? Sasha Lucioni is one of the researchers there. Now, we worry about bias. There's a very famous picture from Bloomberg of the ways that AI models tend to shade the skin of the images they make, depending on the status of the jobs or roles or professions that they're asked to depict. Joy Buolamwini is one of the people who's been drawing attention to the biases that are baked into those systems. Of course, systems based on data are biased because people are biased, but these are ways in which those biases get rehearsed, returned to us. They become hard to see. They become hard to respond to. But what Buolamwini is arguing for is not that, therefore, everyone's cultural data should be absorbed into these systems to make them equal. And one of the reasons for that is something that Meredith Whittaker worries about, which is privacy, which is who owns your behavioural data and your social data, as well as your cultural data. AI agents, as Meredith said, are coming for your privacy as well. So privacy we worry about. We also worry about cultural capture for other reasons. People who may be online may be gendered, may be racialized, may be othered in other ways, have more reason to worry about deepfakes, about the kind of sexualized and unhelpfully and painfully gendered images and ableized images that are appearing on some of these systems. What else do we worry about? Those of us who are being encouraged to catch up and adopt more. As well as those gendered and racialized harms, of course, we worry about harms that may be occurring to people who use social media and whose social media use, particularly young people who are trying to find their identity, to negotiate their identity, are doing that more and more through chatbots, through chatbot friendships, parasocial relationships. And there's recently been a lot of evidence out about that. Now, of course, universities have an important role to play to ensure that young people in our care are making much more sensible use of their interactions with these data architectures. But the ways that we talk about them can make that difficult and can be unhelpful. It can be a dangerous mix. So Naomi Klein is one of the women who's spoken out about the original theft of copyright. But as I said, that was not a one and done. This continues. And so every time we use these architectures, but as individuals, our data may be used and may not be as private as we'd like it to be. But certainly as cultural organisations, which I think universities are, we should be thinking also about the deals that are being done between these big companies and publishers, the people who we want to publish our work through, the people we want students to access their knowledge through, and how the only ways to do that now become through these data architectures, making it difficult for any of us to access the cultural archive through any other means. But there are other means. And I think lastly, and I think this is something it's very easy for the AI industry to, in a way, ignore and tell us to ignore. There's always been a connection between AI and the military, and this is true of all computational technology. AI as a general purpose technology is no different. But the same narrative of precision and objectivity that's been used to legitimize ICE raids and mass bombings is also used as a narrative to sell data monitoring, the idea of generative AI, adding to the glamour and the financial power of both kinds of AI. And the AI industry blurs these differences when it wants a narrative of a general technology equivalent to human intelligence that can do everything, and then it refuses the connection when the association is uncomfortable. But those of us who know anything of the history of AI worry not only about that history, but about its present day acting out and about the companies that are leading behind the scenes, that are leading the educational as well as the military and security sector developments, which produces new geopolitical realities. Now, what I hope we can rest on here is an image of J.D. Vance from the European AI Summit last year, coming and threatening the countries of Europe, particularly, that if we want to regulate AI and if we want to tax digital services, that America will have something to say about it, and producing new geopolitical realities in which we all have to act. Now, all these women who have worried, some of whom have exited the AI industry, the ones I've mentioned, others like Safia Noble, Timnit Gebru, Emily Bender, Margaret Mitchell, they don't lack for technical skills and expertise, as the study showed. But they have sidelined themselves by worrying too much about what the AI industry wants to think of as externalities. What AI is, we are being told, is the interface, it's the service, it's the user experience. And if that's all it is, then we can be told it's brand new. It arrived in 2023, 2022, late 2022. We just have to catch up with it. We have no intellectual or other resources to understand it with because it is so new. But in fact, if we see AI in terms of these much broader narratives and these much longer histories, I think as educators, we can bring in other forms of expertise, other ways we have of knowing this, whether we are philosophers of mind, whether we are medics, whether we are engineers, whether we are computationally skilled, whether we are social scientists, whether we are political and geographical social scientists, we can bring in our explanatory frames, which is what some of these people who have worried have been doing. But let's focus not on the externalities. I told you the first bit was going to be tricky. And let's think about the things that we really need to focus on as educational organisations. Let's suppose we can say those things are not of our concern. Two things very much are. And one is how students learn with and through and alongside generative AI. And the other is what that means for them working going forwards. And we have certainly shifted from hype to cope quite dramatically in the last 3 years in both of those spheres. Let's think about some of the hype about AI for learning. This is from Mark Andreessen's manifesto, AI Will Save the World, and it's on the extreme fringe, but it's not that extreme if you think of the narrative of personalisation. Every child will have an AI tutor that is infinitely patient, infinitely compassionate, infinitely knowledgeable and helpful. And the tutor will be by every child's side, every step of their development, maximising their potential. Now, we don't have to believe in the machine version of infinite love to recognise in there a narrative about personalisation, about immediacy of the help, that teachers can't always be there, but the AI can, which is one of the reasons why it appears so accessible and so personalised and so useful. But the evidence of negative effects on student learning is piling up. Now, I've stuffed some references onto this slide. I have another whole slide of them. And if you want, you can start to click through them. However, I think, and yes, there's another report, which is only just out this week, happily for me, which is from Brookings, which makes particularly disturbing claims about the damage that's been done. They call this report actually a pre-mortem, suggesting that something in the learning relationship is, in danger of actually dying, if not being dead. But I want to say this evidence piling up, I think it matters. I think it's interesting and useful, but it's entirely true that in the same journals, sometimes you can also find evidence that learning outcomes with AI can be achieved faster. Learning outcomes with AI might even have higher scores, even if learning is not as well retained. So although people like me will show you the evidence that learning is damaged, there are other people who will show you, similarly empirical evidence that learning is enhanced, it's made faster, it's made more efficient, that students like it. They don't want it to be taken away. And all these things can actually be true because it depends what we mean by learning. Is learning something that has to be retained? Or is learning the performance that the student can produce in the moment, in the encounter with the technology, whatever that technology may be, a pen, a laptop, an AI, a data model? And a kind of extreme version of that comes from Alexander Wang, who said last year, he was at that time CEO of Scale AI. He then went to Microsoft as their head of their superintelligence lab. I don't keep track of the internal reorganizations of Microsoft, so I'm not sure exactly where, Google rather, I'm not sure exactly where he is now, but he certainly is extremely influential in the AI industry. And he did a rather notorious interview now saying that he was going to wait until they'd figured out the Neuralink, that's the brain-computer interface, before having kids, because he felt that he wanted children who could benefit from this instant access to the cultural archive. Their learning, in this view, which is a kind of extreme form of cognitivism, their learning would be immediate. It wouldn't be intervened with the messy business of interacting with teachers or other students, interacting with ideas that have to be retained for yourself in order to make sense of other ideas. It will be instantaneous, completely individualized, completely personalized. And, this is not a kind of random weirdo. This is a view of learning embodied by many people who are leading the generative AI charge. So learning theory, all learning theory should tell us that we learn what we do. Okay, if you prompt an AI model, you're going to learn to prompt an AI. If you read, you're going to learn to read. If you write, you're going to learn to write. And yes, all of us can learn to think through doing the different things we do. The question is, how are we going to value different ways of thinking, different ways of expressing ourselves, different ways of designing things? How are we going to value that? And therefore, what do we want our students to do? Now, how could we have known? How could anybody have known? But there were those of us, back in early 2023, and I don't want to blow my own trumpet here, but, back in early 2023, some of us were saying that the balance between harms and risks maybe needed to be rethought, particularly because of student learning. Even, I said way back then, even students who follow the recommended approaches to generative AI and prompting, creating first drafts and summaries, creating essay plans, creating explanations, those practices with prompting cut out a lot of textual work. So whether what students are cutting out was a learning opportunity is not something that we necessarily know. We can only answer that in relation to what the purpose of the learning was and the meaning of that learning to the student, for whom writing a summary might have been a really valuable piece of learning to do. Okay, so when we outsource that thinking about what is a learning opportunity, we immediately are on a slope where whatever can get you there quickest is the obvious answer to that question, because the question of what is a learning opportunity for me is precisely one of the things that students are learning at university and that we are helping them to learn. It's not a given, it's not obvious. So what are those purposes of learning that we talked about? Why would students need to learn something? If everything's going to be AI in the AI future, just as Alexander Wang is hoping for his children, then we need to teach them for a world in which everything is going to be AI. However, those promises that the whole of graduate work within 3, 5, 10 years would be occupied by AI, and that would be the whole meaning of graduate work, are also looking a little bit less certain. A reminder again that what we were promised was the phenomenal wealth. The price of many kinds of labour would fall towards zero when powerful AI joins the workforce. We would never have to do a boring day's work again because the boring stuff would be done. And also, this was the mantra: this is the worst AI you will ever use. It will keep getting exponentially better. And actually, Altman said last week, I don't know how many of you follow his musings, that GPT-6 might actually have to be worse than GPT-5 for various reasons that I'm sure have a very good technical explanation. So we're now seeing, just as we're beginning to see this evidence of impact on student learning, that may not be wonderful, we're seeing impacts on graduate employment, not because of massive gains in productivity, because those gains in productivity really at the moment are quite hard to see. But what we don't see is employers desperate to sweep up young graduates because they have AI skills, generic AI skills. What we see from some of the work that's being done on productivity is something that I have been calling the expertise paradox. And I think it's worth just looking for a minute at the expertise paradox. You can go back and look at some of the evidence that productivity gains are not really there to see, and the expertise paradox may be one reason for it. So there's there's a lot of studies, but there's two particular I want to talk about here, which looked at this expertise paradox. The first paradox is the more confident people are in AI's abilities, which tend to be people who are less expert in the field they're asking about, the less critically they look at the outputs. But those people who are confident, people I'm going to call experts, tend to be much more critical, even though that requires more effort. The more expertise you have in a particular topic, the more cognitive effort you're going to be spending when you work with AI to think about, is that right? Does that make sense? Do I need to check it? And this extra expertise, this is exactly what makes expertise crucial. It's expending this expert effort in reviewing the outcomes, in asking if they make sense, in knowing how to improve them, and critically knowing how they might be useful. This is what makes experts using AI less fragile and less prone to error than novices using AI. But the irony is, it's hard work if you're an expert. Struggling students, on the other hand, think they perform better with AI. They rate their performance better. They think AI is more accurate than it is. They finish with an illusion of competence or a delusion of competence. And unfortunately, as this study found, generative AI can actually compound those difficulties and introduce new illusions of confidence and metacognitive difficulty. Now, on the next slide, what you can see is a kind of explanation of how that works in the workplace. So these were some very expert programmers using coding models just to kind of do some boilerplate coding, the sort of thing which is actually a fairly well proven use case for generative AI. They were estimating that it made them 20% more productive. But when the when the researchers went in and actually looked, in the end, if you counted up all the checking that they did, it made them 20% less productive in terms of time. A lot of the early claims about productivity were based on self-reporting, and now we're starting to see some studies that are actually more embedded. We're seeing that the claims of kind of accelerating productivity, at the very least, they're questionable. It's a very nuanced picture. I'm cherry picking. There are some tasks on which it clearly does accelerate, but the point I think is more important is that if, as an expert, we go experimenting with generative AI and we get good results, we should not assume at all that students using the same prompts or using the same techniques will get the same results, because an expert using AI has a very different outcome from a non-expert or a novice using AI to do the same thing. So one of the results of that is that teaching students to prompt in a generic way is not a skill that we should worry too much about, or that their employers are likely to worry about. So this evidence is coming out this year, but if you know anything about learning theory and about how people learn, the evidence itself shouldn't be a great surprise. So as I said, I think this was 2023, early 24, you can only know that AI automation is going to be useful in a task if you're already quite expert in the task. Then you can correct for errors, you can refine the outcomes, you can see where there's going to be a new workflow that might make best use of the AI. And this is true whether your task is writing or diagnosing cancer. Yeah. So universities, and this is where we start to get to the good news. Universities can continue to produce graduates with expertise, being confident that down the line, this is something that employers are going to want. Employers are beginning to realize that experts with AI can find workarounds, can find workflow enhancements, can sometimes be more efficient and effective, can understand what they're doing with the AI, can be creative with it and innovative. These technologies are designed for ease of use, and they will always be relatively easy for experts to use. Expertise, however, is really hard to acquire, and this is where we come in. Now, I'm going to go over the knowledge management slide. Much as I like to knock knowledge management, I'm old enough to remember when the two-word phrase that was on everyone's lips, which was the 1990s, was knowledge management. And that was the thing that was going to solve everyone's problems. And what we ended up with from knowledge management pretty much is Microsoft 360, 365. And so far what we've ended up with from the promises of artificial intelligence has mainly been MS Copilot. So it's kind of interesting to look back at the 90s. But let's think about how we might respond to this entire narrative productively and with agency, not listening to the hype, but also not just throwing ourselves back on having to cope with it. And I've got kind of 3 ideas about this, which I call reframe, repurpose, and resist. And it's not a framework, it's just some words on a slide. You can reframe these how you like. But I think these are 3 ways that we can positively, with agency and with dialogue with our students, begin to reframe this narrative. So how do we reframe the narrative about AI? Well, the narrative out there for students is one of basically an AI arms race. If you look at how the services that are built on top of these models are marketed to students, the teacher is the enemy. The teacher is the person who doesn't want them to pass, and the AI is their friend. Things like full money back guarantee if your content is flagged, okay? But on the other hand, things are being marketed to teachers to detect AI, to engage with our students differently. And I think the only people who win out in this kind of arms race about AI are probably the people selling the AI. So we need to negotiate these terms. And one of the ways we could do that, I think, is to show our hand in that arms race and be honest with our students. So one of the things that I do with students right from the beginning, I don't talk to them about what I expect from them or what they need to do or moralize. I talk to them about how I choose to use AI, which is basically that I don't. So I tell them that I won't be using generative AI to give them any feedback. I won't be using it to engage with them online if we have online discussions. And I tell them I never use it to prepare my learning materials. And quite often that engenders a conversation, and it's interesting. But that's my starting point. And then, of course, as I must, because I'm a lecturer, I talk about what we expect. And I know that you use some versions of the AI assessment scale, and I think it's really useful to help to frame our expectations of students. But then I also think we talk about why that's hard. And one of the other commitments I make to students is that I will tell you when AI is failing you. So I'm treating my students as novices, and I understand that it's hard to know when AI is failing you. And a lot of my feedback, because of course, very, very many, if not most of our students are using AI, is to show them, explain to them, often collectively, how AI fails them in their learning. Not how they're failing, but how AI is failing them. I think how we talk about AI really matters, given some of the harms from parasocial behaviour. So one of the first things I also do with students is to negotiate with them how we're going to talk about generative AI when we do. And I try to guide them towards not anthropomorphizing. So not talking about their generative AI as learning, but talking about data enrichment, model training, being realistic about what's going on behind the scenes. I don't use hype. I don't talk about it as inevitable. I do suggest we should be curious about what's going on under the bonnet and about what's happening with generative AI. And we should be experimental. But I also think we should be really nuanced and differentiated in how we talk about AI, and not as if it's just one thing, but it's definitely different things for different tasks. Something that we're often told is that there are these people called futurologists who are telling us how the AI is going to develop and how we're going to develop as a result. And I take from Kerry Facer the insight that, we're all futurologists and our students are probably better futurologists than we are. So one of the things I like to do with students is to have them think about different possible AI futures. This is a classic kind of quadrant-based approach to futures thinking that some of you will have come across, where we think about the kind of extreme scenarios. So nobody has to think about what they think is going to happen. We just think about the scenario if there's kind of, for example, if AI does turn out to be hugely transformative in all those ways we were promised, or if it doesn't. And on the other hand, what if in either of those cases universities turn out to still be incredibly relevant and degrees incredibly valued by students, or if, on the other hand, universities struggle to retain the value of education. And to work through those scenarios, mainly from the understanding that the future is ours to shape. It's not a given, and we can explore it, we can imagine it. And one of the interesting things about this exercise is that the students in the 4 very different scenarios tend to come back with quite similar ideas about how they think learning at higher education should look in the 4 scenarios, which is, you know, focused on expertise, focused on interaction, focused on the human elements of learning. I think, as well as reframing the narrative, we can, as we are urged to do, repurpose the pedagogy. And what I mean by that is 2 things. One is to trust the things we already know how to do. But I also think we need to lean into the idea that the purposes of doing them become a really important part of the conversation. Not something that we maybe think about when we, have a moment with colleagues or do our continuing professional development and get a moment to think about, why am I here? What am I doing? What is learning? What is teaching? But actually, this needs to be part of the conversation about the very nuts and bolts of how we do every activity we do with students. So I think the positive message is to trust that we know what we do. Not all our learning activities need to change. Not all ideas about expertise that matter need to change. Now, some of the ways that we have standardized assessment and some of the proxies we use to tell us if students are learning absolutely need to change. We are well along that journey. We all understand that. But that does not mean that everything we've taught up till now doesn't matter, or that the things students are going to need when they leave in forms of expertise are completely different. Our disciplines and vocations and practices, if we think about generative AI in that wider frame that I talked about, those worrying externalities, we all have disciplinary resources. We don't have to wait for the AI experts to tell us what AI means. We have intellectual resources and practices that we can use to help us and our students understand the generative AI moment and what it means, if we widen the frame. And I think valuing the process, not the product, it's probably something we keep being told, but I think valuing the process is something we have to invest in. And by that, I mean our institutions have to invest in. And by that, I mean our institutions have to invest in us, because these practices of valuing the process are time intensive. We need to think about a variety of practices, some of them analog, some of them not passing through a data architecture. We have to have one of the things that's been most exciting about generative AI, I have found, is that having taught creative writing and creative workshopping a lot in my life, and actually Rosemary and I did a really lovely making workshop together last year around generative AI. Some of these ideas are finding their way into the curriculum, are finding their way into practice, because we understand that students need to get hands-on and they need to have live practice with some of these things like writing and designing and thinking. Not invigilated, not even high stakes assessment, not even assessed, but just doing those things together in class. But the challenge for us is going to be, if we want to beat the bots, to welcome imperfections and to welcome the variety of experiences and ways of expressing themselves that our students bring to the classroom, and the unfinished projects that a lot of student work will end up being, to value that when we have been working for so many years in an assessment system that values the perfections, that values the achievement, rather than the process. What we want to call authentic assessment is absolutely the hallmark, but that too is costly. Negotiating with partners to produce authentic projects, to give authentic feedback, that all takes time. But we can all have the conversation with students about what feels authentic to them in terms of the imagined futures they have for themselves. I think this point about experts having good judgment and novices not having good judgment is something we can't emphasize to ourselves enough. So an exercise I do with students is having them to go find resources using generative AI, to make resources using generative AI prompts, many of which I copy directly from OpenAI, and to go and find those same resources or similar resources using prompts as keywords in a variety of open source repositories and search engines. And invariably, my students come back with better materials from the second. But do they know they're better? Don't assume they know they're better, okay? Spend the time explaining why certain resources are better for learning than others, more authentic, more differentiated. Model good judgment all the time with students. And then you can also talk about the things like, well, actually creating this image, which doesn't tell us anything at all, has taken far more of the world's resources than going to look for some original photographs or learning materials might have done. So I think modeling good judgment all the time and collectivizing this issue, asking students, what kind of learning do we want to pursue? Quick example of this before moving on, because I know we're out of time. If you ask students, over the last 10, 15 years, do you want to give up your social media? What would they have said? No, over my dead body. Do not take away my social media. But if you offer students the opportunity to be in an environment where there is no social media, actually young people are beginning to create those environments for themselves. Young people in my life, they go to nights out and pubs where you're not allowed to take your phone, you check it in at the door. Young people are pretending to value, they've got their their distraction-free bag with their knitting in it so that they don't scroll, but they do some knitting instead. If you ask people collectively what kind of environment they want to be in, they will talk about how they value being in environments where not everything they say passes through a data architecture, not everything they do passes through social media. And finally, I think now this is the message I think is most provoking, and I apologize if you find it provoking. When I say resist the pressure to adopt, I'm not saying entirely. I'm not saying that there's a standard you should follow. I'm saying that what we need is a variety of intellectual and knowledge ecologies that we can all be in, some of which don't pass through those data architectures. If we nurture this diversity of knowledge ecologies for learning and for our own learning and teaching, some of them will look like spaces in which, in a variety of ways, we exclude these already very intrusive practices and systems and services. And I have to tell you, it takes a lot of ingenuity, both pedagogical and technical, to create that diversity. It's not a question of us being Luddites and turning our back on technology. If you want to create a space now in your classroom where students are engaging with each other, perhaps digitally, but not using a data architecture, a great deal of ingenuity will be required. And this is what creates resilience for the future. So I think these can be very modest proposals, okay? These don't need to be a kind of wholesale rejection. You don't need to be out on the barricades demanding the right to turn off Copilot or whatever. Absolutely not. This is about demanding spaces, safe spaces where other kinds of knowledge practice can flourish, understanding that deliberately these interfaces are compulsive and compelling and attractive and frictionless and easy to use. And if we are going to accept the challenge of sometimes thinking in different ways, we're going to have to create spaces where that challenge can be met and supported kindly and fully. And as I say, this develops technical skills and agency of exactly the kind that employers want from our students, the ability to think laterally and to find workarounds. I'm going to finish by mentioning on the last slide that there are places, and Europe would be one of them, where the attempt to legislate for AI are kind of ongoing and involve a great deal of technical expertise. I work with a lot of universities in Switzerland, for example, where they all use open source for reasons of data sovereignty and AI sovereignty. And those teachers are all very technically capable, let me tell you. So the last message is kind of just remember that we're still here, that the end of the teacher and the teacher's replacement by the bot has been predicted for a long time. Marvin Minsky said in 1970 that the end of the kind of human capable artificial intelligence was only a couple of years away. Ray Kurzweil in 2017 predicted exactly the same thing. The fantasy of the robot teacher has been potent since the beginning of AI, but we're still here. There isn't a teaching machine, in fact. Just as there isn't a learning machine, unless you hold this very narrow and mechanistic view, as Alexander Wang does, of what learning entails. We can, as teachers, always be de-skilled and displaced, but we can't be replaced. And this should give us great confidence that we can lead the conversations with our students and within our institutions. We have the expertise to do that. We understand teaching and learning. We understand the expertise of our subject area. We understand our discipline and we care about it. And we are the right people in the right place to hold those conversations. Thank you.